Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is November 15th, 2024, and let's get to the news and map changes happening in Ukraine and Russia, shall we? I'll talk briefly about the map changes, a few updates here, and I also want to talk about a brief phone conversation that occurred between the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, today, and Putin. And I'll talk about the implications behind this phone call, because clearly we're seeing that the Ukraine partners and the free democratic world is trying to figure out a way out of this war. They're trying to negotiate a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, and what we need to understand behind these negotiations that will occur inevitably next year and will continue throughout the next few months. Now, let's talk about the map, and I want to talk about Kurakhove, Pokrovsk. We have to start here because this is where, again, the situation is extremely tense and difficult for the Ukrainians. Some positive news with regards to a huge defeat of a Russian armored convoy that was heading towards Kurakhove. The Ukrainian military yesterday shared a fantastic video of a Ukrainian 2A6 Leopard tank defeating a Russian convoy of about 12 vehicles, which included MTLBs, BMPs, and a few tanks. And what was really interesting to see is that most of these Russian vehicles had those welded corrugated metal panels limiting their visibility, meaning that already the single Ukrainian tank that engaged in this battle was easily able to pick them off one by one, because the Russians had no idea where the Ukrainian tank was firing from. It was well camouflaged as well, which really helped the Ukrainian Leopard tank, and I believe it happened somewhere between Kurakhove and Dalny. So the battle was around here, and you can see that the disadvantage for the Russians is, of course, that they have the quantity, but they don't have the quality. And the Ukrainians have the advantage of quality vehicles. Imagine if they had both, if the Ukrainians could overwhelm the Russians with hundreds of Leopard 2 tanks and Abrams tanks, and being able to engage the Russians constantly with these modern, not only tanks, but Bradleys. We've seen them being very effective against Russian armored vehicles as well. Unfortunately, Ukraine is severely lacking in those modern IFVs and tanks, right? They need to really maximize their utilization because, when it comes down to the Bradleys, Ukraine has about, I think, less than 200 of them, and some of them are already damaged. Some of them need to undergo constant repairs. And with the Leopards, well, they do have the Leopard 1, which I think they have over 100 of, but the Leopard 2 is also the same amount of number. It's just not enough against the still thousands of tanks that Russia has, even though they're garbage Soviet tanks. T-55s and T-62s, and now very few T-72s and modernized T-80s, T-72s. We barely have been seeing the T-90s as well, the most modern MBT that Russia has. You're seeing that Ukraine still lacks this quantity that it desperately needs. And this video really showcased how important it is that Ukraine receives hundreds of these Leopards. Ukraine is not fighting against a minuscule army. They're fighting against the Russian military that's been stockpiling weapons for the last decades, expecting a war with NATO. And you're really seeing that. And Ukraine is able to hold the Russians to these types of gains. Like, yeah, Russia is advancing, but is that the advances that you're expecting from the world's second largest army? I'm not saying the best army, but the largest army that is mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops per year? No. And it's a pitiful performance by the Russian military. And Ukraine also is facing all of these challenges and obstacles, and yet is capable of really holding off the Russians. So what I'm trying to say here is Ukraine needs to have more support from the West, and this will bring me to the conversation between the German Chancellor and Putin, but it's going to be also a very difficult winter ahead. So if we're talking about the map and the changes and things like that, in the situation in Ukraine, it will be a very difficult winter ahead. The silver lining, of course, is the fact that the winter is not going to be conducive for successful offensive operations for the Russians. They'll have far more difficulty pushing through. And the good news that this week it's already, the temperature around Pokrovsk and Kurakhove are heading towards the 0 below freezing temperature, 0 to -2 degrees. There will be a lot of rain next week as well. So we're going to have now the muddy season approaching in the next few weeks. There's going to be some snowfall as well, and that will really complicate the offensive for the Russians. Not that they will stop, because they'll continue throwing meat. They'll continue doing everything possible to take as much land as possible, because their Tsar is giving them the order to die. But they'll definitely have less success because during the dry season, it's definitely easier to advance, to get around with mobile vehicles, like with the ones we've seen, the desert crosses, the ATVs, the scooters. The Russians had an overwhelming advantage of manpower, and with cheap vehicles like the scooters, then they can just drive through crop fields, through inaccessible roads, which are not defended by the Ukrainians, which allows them to be far more maneuverable. And winter is not going to be conducive for that. So that's the silver lining, but we can expect the Russians to not only make it brutal for the Ukrainians in terms of the battlefield, but also likely that they've been stockpiling in the last few months missiles to start hitting the Ukrainian energy grid, its infrastructure, and this will be also a very difficult winter for the Ukrainians, unfortunately. So we need to continue supporting the Ukrainians with that regard, continue helping the Ukrainians, whether it be for the FPV drone funds or humanitarian aid. The Ukrainian people absolutely need your help, guys. So please, if you have any extra dollars you're willing to donate, please donate them to the Ukrainian cause, because that's really important. So that's the situation with regards to Pokrovsk and Kurakhove. Russia and its troops continue advancing very slowly, and it's very tense here. Thankfully, on the western side of Pokrovsk, around Toretsk, the Ukrainians are able to hold off the Russian advances. There's a heavy urban combat ongoing right now around Toretsk. And I've shared a lot of stories here. The Ukrainians counterattacked briefly, and then the Russians pushed back. So there's a lot of back and forth, kind of a tug of war between the Ukrainian troops in the city center of Toretsk. Very heavy battles are ongoing, but the Russians don't really do well in urban combat, as we've seen in the past. So thankfully here, the situation is more or less stable. The Ukrainians are able to hold off this massive Russian assault in the area of New York and Toretsk. Another kind of strange and I guess bad development, but thankfully the Ukrainians confirmed that they've stabilized the situation, is around Kupiansk. And this is something quite surprising in my opinion. As you can see, there's a thin line heading towards Kupiansk, a gray line here. And yesterday, it was briefly mentioned that a very small Russian squad was able to break through here and take up positions on the western side of Kupiansk, as you can see here. Today, there was a video that was released by the Ukrainian military, confirming that they were able to dislodge, to kill these Russian occupiers, and they took a few of them prisoners. So thankfully, the Ukrainians stabilized the situation here. But it just begs the question as to how they were able to break through in the first place, right? You would have thought that this road would have been one of the most heavily defended roads. And how did a small Russian squad manage to break through here? So I'm hoping that some clear reviews will be taken in the next few days and that this will not happen again, because this is very problematic. You're sending a message to the Russians that this is a weak spot, and they're definitely going to try to utilize it to get close to Kupiansk. So it's a worrisome development. And I'm really hoping that the Ukrainians have taken this seriously and are currently patching this, perhaps the hole in their defense in this sector. But overall, you're seeing that the Russians are applying maximum pressure. They've created a small pocket here from the area of Sankove on the western side of the Oska River to the north as well. So the Ukrainians here are not in a very good position, but they continue holding it. And even if Russia was to take this entire area, it would not put the Ukrainians at a massive disadvantage, because the city of Kupiansk is still divided by the Oska River. There is a bridge here that they can blow up, and the Ukrainians still have the heights over Kupiansk. But it's not going to be a walk in the park for the Russians, I guarantee it to you guys. So that's the development for the Kharkiv area. Now, I really wanted to talk about two things. One of them is the Ukrainians also conducted a successful UAV attack in Krasnodar. So overnight, the pro-Russian Telegram channels mentioned that the Ukrainians attacked the Crimean airfield in Krymsk, which is not too far away from the large port city of Novorossiysk, and that there were over 3 or 4 dozen Ukrainian drones that attacked this airfield. So perhaps the next few days, we're going to have satellite confirmation of the destruction of several Russian bombers and jet fighters, and perhaps even ammunition depots that were storing very likely the FAB glide bombs that the Russians are utilizing to destroy Ukrainian cities and terrorize the Ukrainian population. So that is a positive development, hoping that this weekend is also going to be very fruitful for the Ukrainian UAVs, and they'll be able to hit more of these airfields and ammunition bases. So that's a good development. And last but not least, let's talk about the phone call between Olaf Scholz and Putin, which has drawn a lot of criticism because, again, we're opening communication lines with the Kremlin. Now, my personal opinion is that this is important. We need to have an open communication line with the Kremlin, but never take their word for it. They're going to constantly lie and manipulate the information. So, although I do believe that we need to be discussing the war with the Kremlin, because you're not going to be concluding this war with Ukraine sitting on the table alone. You need Russia on the other side of the table, but you need to bring Russia to the side of the table on the weak position. They need to be forced into it and not feel like they are going to be the winners out of these negotiations. And so Olaf Scholz, I mean, based on the official reports of the conversation, which lasted an hour between Scholz and Putin, and let me remind my viewers that this conversation, the last time they spoke was 2 years ago, a little bit over 2 years ago. So right in the beginning of the conflict, of the war, when it started. And nothing really new was discussed. They say that they called Putin, they discussed the end of the war, he condemned the invasion and reiterated Germany's support of Ukraine, that Russia must withdraw from Ukraine and that there must be a ceasefire. And apparently Putin didn't say anything different. He spoke with the language of ultimatums, said that Ukraine needs to accept the reality on the ground. So I'm not sure what the purpose of this call was. Perhaps it was just a pulse check of Putin to see, if he perhaps wants a way out, he wants to end this war, but perhaps that was the purpose. Also, we know that next year, Olaf Scholz will likely not be the German chancellor in 2025. There is going to be an election. Perhaps he's trying to win political points to make himself look like he's a strong negotiator and mediator. I don't know. But we haven't heard anything that we haven't heard in the past. So the purpose of this call, I think, was perhaps more of a pulse check for Olaf Scholz to understand that Russia ain't going to change. What is important here, and this is something that I completely agree with, I want to share with you guys the statement of Mikhailo Podolyak, who is the advisor of President Zelensky. And I believe 2 days ago, he issued the statement on Twitter. So he posted this, and you guys can let me know what you think in the comment section, but I fully agree with this, and I think that Europe starts understanding this more and more. He says, quote, "Forcing Ukraine to negotiate on any unfavorable terms is extremely strange, because in essence, they propose to force Ukraine to give up its resistance, but they don't discuss real scenarios of forcing Russia, the aggressor, to stop its aggression, to pay the maximum financial and legal price for its aggression, peace at the expense of the victim, of the country that was attacked, and no need to discuss ways for the aggressor to pay. Why should this strange construct lead to peace?" And it's evident. It's so simple, but evident to all of us. We understand that Russia needs to pay a price here, because otherwise you're just incentivizing Russia to continue with its aggression. And likely, if Russia was to agree to a ceasefire, Putin is really aiming on, he will only accept a ceasefire that will allow him, that will put him in a position to launch another offensive easily in a matter of months, not years. Now I'm convinced that Putin, if he was to agree to ceasefire, it would only be on the condition that he can launch another offensive very quickly in a matter of a few months. I really do believe that. Putin doesn't have a few years at this stage, and he's not going to try to redo the 2015-2022 scenario where he waited it out, he hoped for Ukraine collapse, and that didn't happen, so then he went all in 2022 with the full-scale invasion. Like, Putin has a few months, and he's really aiming for a ceasefire that will force Ukraine to be in the position where they need to accept unfavorable terms, where Russia gets to keep all of its presence in occupied territory. So then they can rearm quickly, they can coordinate future attacks with North Korea, with China, with Iran, and also perhaps coordinate future provocations, not only in Ukraine, but in the Baltics, on the the Korean Peninsula, in the South China Sea, coordinate with all of the Russian partners to destabilize the world. And that's what's at stake here. And this is what Mikhailo Podolyak is talking about, is that, we need to change our philosophy around this war, that we cannot be as infantile as we were back in 2014 and 2015, where we imposed unfavorable terms for Ukraine with the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. It's simply not going to work. We're just asking for another Russian invasion in the next few months if that was to happen in 2025. So with all that, I wanted to end this video with this short comment on the call between Putin and Scholz, and why it's so important that Ukraine is given the resources and the opportunity to be on an advantaged position when it comes down to these negotiations. And this is one of the biggest irritants that I have, actually, is that NATO and Ukraine partners still are not voicing this strategy, this vision of how they're planning to allow Ukraine to come out on favorable terms when it will come down to having negotiations with Russia. It's all, more or less about what Ukraine has to give up, which is so frustrating because we know that's just not going to work. Ukraine will give up, its territory will give up something, and Russia will just continue being incentivized to attack, to be more aggressive, not only in Ukraine, but with other nations. So Europe, absolutely, specifically Europe, needs to really, really start voicing their strategy, their vision as to how they can strengthen Ukraine and how they can force Russia on the negotiating table, not Ukraine on the negotiating table. It's all about forcing the Russians to feel like they've been weakened, severely weakened, that they don't have the choice anymore, but to start talking about peace. That's what's important. So thank you for support, guys. Please donate to the Ukraine drone program. There's a link in the description below for the Rosoriz drone fund. That helps save thousands, if not millions, of Ukrainian lives every hour. The Ukrainians are dying heroically, and they're fighting for democracy and the values that we believe in. So please, just a few dollars can make a huge difference. Thank you so much for support, and I will see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!